Well, good evening, everybody. Lovely that you've been able to join us on this Thursday evening. My name is Sian Prior. I'm a writer, broadcaster, and writing teacher. And on behalf of the Geelong Regional Library Corporation, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, which is Humanity's Moment with author Dr. Joëlle Gergis. I'd like to start by acknowledging Wadawurrung and Eastern Maar, original owners of the lands where the library services operate, and the Wurundjeri people on whose land I am currently living. We pay respect to Wadawurrung, Eastern Maar, and Wurundjeri elders past, present, and emerging. We acknowledge and celebrate the First Nations peoples of this land as the custodians of learning, literacy, knowledge, story, and country. The first custodians of biodiversity on this continent, arguably the best. Some brief housekeeping reminders for you before we begin our discussion. We welcome your participation in this webinar, particularly towards the end when we'll be able to take your questions and I'll be able to put them to Joëlle. All you need to do is click on the Q&A button at the bottom right-hand side of your screen and type in your question or comment. You may need to touch your screen first to see the Q&A function pop up if you're using an iPad or an iPhone. So you can submit questions at any time during the discussion, and then after we've spoken for about 40 minutes, we will do our best to answer as many of those as possible. And you can also vote on each other's questions, which will help us to prioritise the ones that you're interested in having Joëlle answer. And I guess that's a really useful technique because people may have the same question and may be keen that if someone else has already written it there, keen that one come up. Also, the webinar is being recorded. So if you'd like to watch or listen to the discussion again or recommend it to friends or family, it will be uploaded to the library's YouTube channel within the next couple of days. So you'll be able to access it that way. Look, I can't tell you how delighted I am to facilitate tonight's event with Joëlle. And that's because we go way back. We first met, I think, about a decade and a half ago when Joëlle was doing an RMIT writing course in which I was teaching. And look, I know you're not meant to have favourites as teachers, but there were lots of reasons why I confess I did take a particular interest in Joëlle's work. She was a very good writer. She cared passionately about the looming threat of climate change. She wanted to use her skills as a writer to try to do something about that. And she was already a climate scientist. So, you know, she was eminently qualified to do all of those things. These days, she works at the Australian National University, where she's an internationally recognised expert in Australian and Southern Hemisphere climate variability and change. She's also served as lead author for the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, a global state-of-the-art review of climate change science. And this extraordinary experience, as being part of the IPCC process, is at the heart of her new book, Humanity's Moment, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope. It's a book that, yes, delivers the bad news that we need to hear, but ultimately is optimistic when it comes to the prospect of solving this overwhelming global environment threat that we face. Joëlle's book shows us that the solutions that we need to live sustainably already exist. We just need the social movement and the political will to create a better world. So, yeah, I'm really glad that there's a positive end to this story. Joëlle, very lovely to see you again.
Oh, it's a real delight, Sian, to have this opportunity to speak with you tonight.
So look, let's go way back to begin with, because I want to know why you decided to become a climate scientist. What was it about this field of science that excited you, or was it something else other than the science that excited you?
Well, I guess I've always had a real interest in the natural world. That was my first and foremost, I guess, interest in science. But then in 1994, there was a really big bushfire that encroached on Sydney, and there was, ash raining down on my suburb and burnt leaves and all that sort of stuff. It was a really dramatic summer. And I think it was one of the really for the first time where I felt like extreme weather had really intruded into my daily reality. And it was huge. It was a really big event. I guess the same way that young people right now would think about the Black Summer that we've just had. For me, it was that moment where I really felt this ferocity in Australian weather and climate. And I guess that led me to want to learn more about the world, really, and understanding not just the physical aspects of the climate system and all that sort of stuff, but also people. So I'm really interested in people and places. And so I guess that probably was the origin point of really wanting to understand, why is it that Australia has this really erratic climate? Where does it come from? What are the processes that drive that? And so that led me on to studying science at university, and then going on to do a PhD, and subsequently being a research scientist, which I've been for, such a long time now.
Yeah. Okay. So in a way, there was a sort of an activist kernel at the heart of your scientific bent. Even way back, you saw a problem and you wanted to try and respond to it.
Yeah, I think I was just really amazed at how devastating these impacts could be on human societies, but also on ecosystems as well. And so for me, I guess there was this real curiosity to want to get to the bottom of it. Why do we have these bushfires? Why do we have such erratic weather? And I think that really led me it led me to do a PhD really on climate variability and understanding the largest source of climate variability on the planet, which is El Nino. Many people online would have probably heard of that. And that's still something we're still trying to understand as the research community right now. I mean, right now we're in the La Nina phase. We've got really above average rainfall conditions. And so part of what's happened with the catastrophic flooding of the East Coast we've seen is related to this phenomenon. And so we're still trying to get a handle on that. But global warming is actually changing natural variability. So it's a really difficult thing to try and get a handle on.
Mm. Well, if you had to choose a science, you probably couldn't have chosen a more complex and difficult science than climate science. And I speak from a level of painful personal experience, because as Joëlle knows, 35 years ago, I worked as a climate campaigner for the Australian Conservation Foundation. 35 years ago, we knew what was coming down the line at us. And I will never forget having to try and wrap my very humanities-oriented brain around things like, ozone depletion, what we called then the greenhouse effect, trying to learn about the circumpolar vortex and its interaction with the ozone layer. It does take a particular kind of brain to be able to not just understand, but then synthesize, retain, and research information in this area, which has so many variables and so many inputs. What is it about your brain, Joëlle, that makes it the right kind of brain for climate science?
I guess curiosity, to be honest, Sian. I just want to understand why the world works the way it does. And I personally find things like, understanding ocean currents or the way that the atmosphere behaves, our frozen parts of the planet, how all these things interact to create this miraculous planet that we have, which is really unique in the solar system. And I think for me as well, something I've been connecting with as I've been speaking to different people, as I've been out with this book, is remembering that Australia is actually a really unique part of the world. So we have more unique plants and animals here in Australia than we do anywhere else on the planet. So places like Brazil or Madagascar or Papua New Guinea, Australia is extraordinary. And as a young scientist, actually studying science in Australia was phenomenal. I mean, just the sorts of things you get to do on field trips and just understanding how unique, our landscapes are, our culture. It's just amazing. So for me, I guess it's just inherently, I'm really fascinated by the world and our cultures. So I'm not just one of these people that's just into maths and physics. I really love cultures, and that intersection for me is where I feel is I guess my life's work. I suppose I've, the motivation to slog through really difficult, calculus tutorials and chemistry labs and all that sort of stuff. But I still really love literature, and I love music. and I love all those things that I think, in my book, I break up the content in terms of the head and the heart. And it's a way I like to think about things, because we can understand something intellectually, but until we understand something on an emotional level, I think, well, this is part of the problem. And I guess this is part of what we'll talk about tonight. And a lot of what I really, really hope that my readers connect with is understanding that ultimately, when you just boil it all down, it's really just about the fact that we will protect the things we care about. It's actually no more complicated than that. And right now, there's things I think that are vying for our attention, but I think most people would agree that the escalating extremes that we're witnessing in a country like Australia and abroad, I mean, there isn't a single day actually really that there isn't some kind of new extreme that's being broken. We've just seen Pakistan, the flooding in Pakistan, where a third of that country is underwater, over 33 million people. So it's more than the population of Australia displaced just from an intense monsoon season. So that isn't, it's just monsoon, right? So there's nothing, it is monsoon during a La Nina event, so it's amplified, but I guess this is the new normal in terms of natural variability playing out. And so for people like me, it's a little bit stressful, to be honest, because, you can see these, the observations are playing out in a way that I think are a lot faster than we would have anticipated. So they're consistent with what we would expect from the projections. But I guess for me, and perhaps we'll talk about this, is I did have a breakthrough moment when I was working on this UN climate report, and I really was able to see everything all at once, and then it just snapped into view. It wasn't just Australia that's experiencing the sorts of things that we've talking about, like with catastrophic floods and extreme drought and really devastating bushfire seasons, but this is happening all over the world. And I think for me, that was my moment. Someone asked me recently what was my moment, and I think it was really IPCC was sort of like a gate you pass through and you can't go back. So I think the knowledge I have now as a result of that really, to be honest, compelled me to write this book. I actually could not go back to just writing research papers with the knowledge that I had. It felt so urgent to me that I felt really the most important thing I can do right now is write this book. And to be honest, and I really believe this, I think this is probably the most important book I'll ever write. And the reason why I say that is because really what happens in the next 10 years in terms of the carbon budget is really, really important. So if we don't really turn it around this 10 years, because the next IPCC report will come out in the 2030s, and by then, in a sense, there'll be some aspects of climate change that are locked in and irreversible. So we want to avoid that, and we still have that window. And I guess that's part of what I really want to say in this book, is that sometimes people really think that this is all like runaway climate change and methane bombs and abrupt climate change, and this is all really out of our hands, and the science does not bear that out. So I guess I wanted to distill the state of the climate science so people can understand, and you don't have to be a scientist to read this book. Trust me, none of my friends are, basically. So for them to be able to know what I do, I had to write something that people could understand. And plus, it's also, you don't need to be a climate scientist. It's the same way that, if you go to a cardiologist, you don't necessarily need to be, a doctor to understand, but you're going to trust in the person who actually has done that training. So I've given.
And that's been one of the big problems, hasn't it, in terms of actually taking the action we needed to slow down some of these really critical problems that we're now facing. Is that I don't know whether it was, well, there were certainly some people who didn't trust the climate scientists. There were others who just clearly thought, well, it's too complicated for me to even try to wrap my head around. So you put together the people who didn't believe it, the people for whom it was too hard, and the people for whom there were vested interests in trying to undermine our faith in what climate scientists were telling us. It was a pretty terrible trifecta, wasn't it, of people getting in the way of doing something about this.
Oh, a very dark era. And I'm pleased to say we are popping out the other side of that. And part of what I wanted to do in this book is shine a light on what's actually involved in the IPCC process. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is this United Nations effort that happens every 7 years, where a whole group of scientists collate the state of the climate system. And basically it's a big report card, if you like. It only happens every 7 years because it's a serious amount of work. One volume alone is over 1 million words. So just to give an indication, there are 3 volumes and 3 supplementary volumes. It doesn't include all the computer code and the glossary and all the technical appendices. And so that's a lot of information, right? But I should say as well, that's all volunteer. So none of us are paid to do this work. And so that's done on top of our standard jobs. And for me, I'm a university lecturer and a research scientist. And this goes on for 3.5 years.
And I have to say, I was both astonished and horrified when I read that it was all volunteer. And then I thought about it for a little bit and I thought, okay, well, given we did have these nuts trying to argue that climate scientists were making up the threat of climate change in order to be able to sort of feather their own nests, I thought, okay, politically, you couldn't have been paid to do that work, could you?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Sian. I think that's really true. But I guess the other thing that the IPCC does is that our work goes out to several rounds of expert and government review. And so we actually had 75,000 reviewer comments on our work. So if you can imagine, if you've ever written a thesis or any sort of thing like that, can you imagine getting 75,000 reviewer comments that you then need to respond to, address, and then the response has to go into a publicly available database. So the transparency for me, like working at that level, I think was an extraordinary experience. But just to give you an indication of just how rigorous the process is, how transparent, it's phenomenal. It really is. I mean, it's amazing to think that you can get a group of human beings to do this, and not only just do this, but our lucky group was the group that was impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. And so, as you might imagine, with the United Nations process, our first 3 meetings were in person, because when you're dealing with people from Colombia and Russia and China and everywhere, you need to be in the same time zone because it's really difficult. But when coronavirus hit, we had to shift online. And so, unfortunately, for one of the 12 Australians involved in this process, that often meant, 5 a.m. on a Saturday morning, 7 o'clock on a Friday night, 3 a.m. on a Wednesday. That's pretty hard, right? That's hard on top of all the other stuff that we were doing. So I guess I shine a little bit of a light on the actual process, just so people are aware that, I mean, for me, part of the reason why I think I was able to find hope is that, sometimes we can get really disillusioned with human beings, and we can think, oh, people just, they don't care, or everybody is just so self-interested and all this sort of stuff. But what was really amazing about working at the IPCC sort of UN level was that altruism was just extraordinary, and we also saw that in the COVID-19 pandemic, where we saw, our healthcare workers, and we saw it in the Black Summer with our fireys. People are good. There is inherent goodness in people. And so that black and white thinking actually isn't very helpful. And I think when things get dark, it's important to remember that you have a choice about, being someone that restores someone's faith in humanity or not. And for me, I suppose it's an act of hope, to try and be part of the group of people that tried. And so for me as a scientist, I probably won't do IPCC again, because it was just huge, and it's a massive undertaking. But I guess I contributed everything I could at sort of peak of my career, where I could really put in those hours and be supported to do that and things like that. So, but it's
because there's a lot of talk, isn't there, about asking yourself when your kids, grandkids, great grandkids, whatever, say, well, what did you do about this? And there's a bit of a sense of like, well, we all need to have an answer to that. And yours is a really good one.
Well, thanks, Sian. I guess that's been my life experience. And I suppose that's what I've been able to contribute. But, when people are asking me at the moment, what's the most important thing that they can possibly do to do something about climate change, the answer that has come to me just really in recent days is just understanding that you're living through the most profound moment in human history. So we're going to look back at the 2020s as this moment, the same way that we think about like the revolutionary 1960s, where a lot of things changed. The 2020s are really going to be this moment where humanity either rises to the challenge and we restabilize the Earth's climate, or we don't. And really it is what they call the critical decade. So it is I cannot stress how important it is, but it's just understanding that we are the generation that are living through this change, and the people alive today are literally going to determine the fate of humanity. I know that's a really big thing to say, but trust me, I back it up in my book. There's a lot of evidence there. So
Yeah.
it's really, if you stop and think about how profound that moment is, I think that is a way of redefining and sharpening up your own, how you find meaning in your life at this moment, because there's a lot of really grim stuff out there. And I know climate change is not the easiest thing when we're dealing with a pandemic, we're dealing with, political instability and war, and it's hectic out there, right? And as a climate scientist, I feel all of that really acutely, because I know now on the top of all of that, we have climate change escalating and breaking through into people's reality and their lived experience. But I guess coming back to my main point, which is really recognizing and waking up to the fact we are in this moment, this really profound moment. And then from there, things will come. So you'll figure out what you can do. And it might be, there's so many different things you can do alongside the sort of practical things of, renewable energy and all those sorts of things that I do cover in the book as well. But everyone has a unique contribution. And in particular, I talk about the creative arts sector, because I really feel that you can't expect a whole bunch of nerdy scientists to lead a social movement. I'll tell you that right now. That's not going to happen, right?
Well, but also it goes against everything that science instructs you to do, which is to be cautious, which is to be conservative, which is to be careful. And that must drive, I know that it does drive a lot of climate scientists bananas, because the size of the problem is so immense. And yet the kind of, the level of the style of communication has had to be so cautious. So how do you, well, I suppose that's the gap that you're entering into, isn't it, Joëlle?
Absolutely. And I guess my first sort of response to that would be that you can still be logical and rational and professional, right? That's the bread and butter of what we do. And it's actually a really rigorous science, as you'll find. But then to have an emotional response is also a really rational thing, because if you think about it, for me, part of my, I guess, awakening around this, just how quickly this was all unfolding, was really, we've seen 50% of the Great Barrier Reef die off since 2015, and that doesn't actually take in the 2020 mass bleaching event or the 2022 event that happened earlier this year. So that's an underestimate, right? So the largest living organism on the planet is actually dying on our watch right now. Okay, so for me, that was number one. Number two was the Black Summer, where we basically saw 25% of Australia's temperate forests burn in a single bushfire season. That's extraordinary. A big bushfire season would be something like 2%. So 25% is just orders of magnitude in terms of it actually created a new global record, which is extraordinary in itself. But as a result of that, we saw, 3 billion animals either killed or displaced. And now, because of such severe habitat destruction along the East Coast, the koala is actually an endangered species in this country now. I mean, just stop and think about that just for a moment. Our most iconic animal is endangered in this country. I don't know about you guys, but we need to have a conversation about our values, right? So culturally, are we all good with that? So I suppose when I think about the sort of the way forward here, if we, in terms of the political change we need, our politicians need to reflect our values. And so they're things that we develop collectively. So our collective...
And they're developed collectively in part through what you mentioned before, culture, arts, literature,
right. Exactly.
Entertainment, theatre. These are the ways in which we think through and decide on and cement what we value.
Absolutely. And it's how we find meaning, Sian, in those things, right? So it's so important that, collectively, that we need to say that we value having an intact biosphere right now, and we value the Great Barrier Reef for its intrinsic value, but also just for, gosh, so many reasons, right? And so, but it isn't just here in Australia. This is the thing. IPCC is, like I said, that one-way gate where that's it. Like you see everywhere. And I suppose for me, as an Australian, I was literally, as I was working on this report, all these things were happening. And then the icing on the cake, of course, for me, was the flooding of the East Coast. As I was doing the final copy edit of this manuscript, my husband's family is from Lismore, and we've got family who are still displaced from that event. I can't actually describe what it was like going back to Lismore to visit family and to see the devastation of the impact of that. And just in terms of just quickly some numbers, just north of Lismore, there was 775 millimeters of rainfall fell in a 24-hour rainfall period. So that's the equivalent of all of Melbourne's rainfall for an entire year in just a 24-hour rainfall period. So you can imagine just the reconfiguration of landscapes and, aquatic systems and of course, social systems. Every single business, cafe, restaurant, shopfront just gutted, right? I'd never seen anything like that in Australia. I mean, I've traveled to many places in the developing world, but to see that level of devastation was, I think it something clicked for me. And I realized that, we're not just talking about numbers on a graph here. We're talking about the people and the places that we love. And so I guess that's why I felt compelled to write short form pieces that I've published in places like The Monthly, The Saturday Paper, and various other, The Guardian, just to get that out there so people are joining the dots. Because the thing is, these things are unfolding. And for someone like me, I mean, for me, I was on the water cycle chapter, right? So I'd been sitting there looking at droughts and floods all over the world, changes in monsoons and ocean circulation, all these sorts of different things. And then this event plays out. And then because we're such a conservative community, people are like, well, we have to wait till we can do the hardcore attribution, which is when you do a modeling study, compare it to the observations and say it was made, 10 times more likely because of climate change or whatever, those sorts of statistics. That's fine. That's really important work, but it's probably going to take years. Okay. And so it's entirely consistent with the theory, right? So theoretically, it's consistent with what we expect. So for me, I don't feel too compelled to wait 3-4 years to tell the public that actually this is actually what climate change looks like in this country. So that's why I came out, and that's why I've been doing what I do. That does add an extra layer of work, I suppose, to my life.
Are you criticised by any of your colleagues for this kind of art/activist element of your work?
No, I'm not, to be honest, Sian, because I never, ever come out and say anything that I don't feel is grounded solidly in the science. So I'm really upfront about the uncertainties associated with rainfall. Is particularly complex because, Australia's a land of drought and flooding rains, right? So we've got a lot of inherent natural climate variability. But because of that, the climate change signal can get embedded in there. So it gets a bit lost. And it takes time to what they call statistically emerge from the background of natural variability. But that's already emerged in 60% of the globe. In Australia, a really clear signal in rainfall extremes starts to emerge by the 2040s. It's already emerged on daily timescales, but in terms of slightly longer timescales. So this is getting into the weeds a bit, but just to give you an idea that it's going to emerge. It is emerging. That is what it is. We can see it in other regions. It's really consistent in other mid-latitude areas around the world. So I feel comfortable saying that because also quite literally, I was working on the water cycle chapter and we're talking about the intensification of extremes and what happens to, intense rainfall and all that sort of stuff. So for me, but also having that really long association with Lismore and walking around the streets of Lismore where the 1974 flood level is really high up on these power poles and they're towering above you as you walk through. And that record was broken by a full 2 meters. So long-time locals couldn't even prepare for that. It wasn't, the Bureau of Meteorology couldn't even get that system. This was something else, which leads me to freak out, really, I guess, as a scientist, because I can see and join the dots and it's part of a global trend. And I suppose the role of someone like me, if I'm not actually helping the public make sense of it, then it's sort of like if you think about the commentators with the coronavirus situation. People are still providing their expertise in the face of imperfect knowledge. All I can do as a scientist is provide you with what I think is an informed expert opinion on something. And there'll be more evidence coming soon. But as we'll find, unfortunately, you don't want to be able to say in hindsight, oh, okay, well, that actually really was something. Like, for instance, with tipping points in the climate system, we'll only really see them in hindsight. When it's actually playing out, that's statistically very noisy. So,
Joëlle, I think about you often because I'm very concerned about climate change, and I'm very conscious of you being right there on the front line of this stuff. And sometimes I find myself wondering, how does Joëlle stay sane? Because for me, what your position is like, it's like someone is lying on the train tracks and there's a train coming for that person, and someone else is standing by and they're not allowed to intervene, or they don't know how to intervene, but they can see the train coming. And how does that not drive you completely insane?
oh, look, I think it does drive me insane some days, but I suppose ultimately I'm driven by the desire to protect our planet. Ultimately, the science tells us we can stabilize the warming. Okay, as soon as we reduce emissions, temperatures follow suit. That's actually really good news. So it basically means we don't get the runaway climate change. I was really happy to read that, because there's a bit of misconception out there that climate change, the genie's out of the bottle, can't do anything about it.
Yeah. But, tipping points, etc., etc.
Exactly. Yeah. But the truth is that, at higher levels of warming, we do start to trigger some of those things, but we're not there yet. But just think about what we've experienced with 1.2 degrees of global warming right now. So then think 1.5, then think 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 4 degrees. Right now, currently implemented policies basically have us at warming between 2 and 4 degrees, which is a catastrophic overshooting of the Paris Agreement targets. And even with the net zero pledges that are on the table at the last UN summit in Glasgow in 2021, that still sees us warm by about 2 degrees. So 2 degrees is bad news for the ice sheets in terms of sea level rise. You're looking at 99% of coral reef ecosystems being decimated, and there's 25% of marine life that has its part of its life cycle in those systems. And of course, the cultural elements and so on and so forth. They're a big cascade. So clearly what we're doing isn't enough. So that motivates me, because there's a scientific case here, basically. We have a case that the planetary system can adapt to the change. And it's extraordinary, actually, to think about that. But what's also really interesting to think about is that every single decision we've ever made to exploit the natural world has led us to this moment, where we're literally destabilizing the Earth's climate. I mean, and you were saying like 35 years ago, Sian, you guys were, you got that, but now we're literally seeing it in ways that are statistically very clear. But back then, when IPCC the first report came out in the 1990s, it was still starting to emerge, but now it's so clear and the evidence is escalating. It's so widespread. There isn't a single ocean basin or part of the Earth's surface that has not been touched by human activity. So it's so clear now. It's so clear that we actually say in the report that, human-caused climate change is an established fact. Now, that's strong language for IPCC, trust me, because we agonize over every single word, over every single sentence endlessly. So now it's basically like saying it's like gravity or plate tectonics, right? The evidence is so solid. And that's a credit to our community, I must say. It's an extraordinary community to be a part of, because, as you mentioned, climate science is very complex, because you're dealing with, the biosphere, all the living parts of the planet, the frozen parts of the planet, the oceanic parts, all the watery parts of the planet, and of course, the land. All those things interact to create this extraordinary planet that we're on. And we should be better custodians. And so I guess that brings me back to, I can either curl up in the fetal position and just be completely disillusioned and absolutely just really dark on humanity. And I have those days, I'm not going to lie to you, right? That I do have those days, but ultimately, this is the time I've been born in. This is the life that I'm living. And I also talk about some of my family background. I've got an Egyptian heritage. So, I know that if I had grown up in Egypt, I probably wouldn't have had the opportunities I have as an Australian. There's just no way. There's no way. So I see my life as extraordinarily privileged that I've had an education. I've managed to work on something I'm really passionate about and really interested in. And yes, it is really hard, but it's also, it's pretty amazing if you stop and think about it. You know, there are many people, and one of the crazy statistics in the book was like 25% of the Earth's of the human population lives in slum conditions. Like, right? So we can't actually expect, when you think about the inequality and the entrenched inequality and the injustice of that, you know, that's something I think that as people that live in a country like Australia, we really do have to stop and check our privilege and think, well, actually, what can we do? And if you're certainly reading my book, then, you know, you got an education, you probably got a roof over your head, you can do something. And so do anything, just do something is what I'm trying to say. This book is basically like saying, we need you. The scientific community needs you. The world needs you right now. Every living creature needs you. So please do something. And I'm not even saying you have to be a climate scientist or even a climate activist, but there's something that you can do. And I'm happy to talk more about that. But I guess that's where I drill down and eventually get to, is that for me to have a meaningful life, Sian, I have to find a way through it. And so for me to find a way through it, I mean, beauty and heartbreak sit side by side, right? And so for me, you know, I talk a lot about art, and art can be political and can, you know, be a catalyst for extraordinary change, but it can also just be beautiful and can be a reminder that, God, it's so good that someone, you know, composed that piece of music or wrote that gorgeous poem or whatever it is that moves your emotional world. So for me, I think that is a reminder that there's so much inherent beauty in humanity, and when we want to do amazing and beautiful things, we can do them.
And is that the essence of what you mean when you say a climate scientist's case for hope? Is your essential hope in capacities of humans to tackle this?
Yeah, I think it is.
You're optimistic that we have the capacity to deal with this?
I have no doubt that altruism exists. I've experienced firsthand, and I feel like I try and live my life according to my values. So I'm not a perfect person by any stretch of the imagination, but I do what I can, right? And I think a lot of people do the best that they can. A lot of people are struggling with a lot of difficult things, and I completely acknowledge that climate change is overwhelming, and it is something that feels like just a bit too much to deal with. But I suppose inherently most people want to do the right thing. And I think also sometimes people switch off because they think that it's too overwhelming and they can't do anything. But I think the Australian federal election results that we saw in May this year was a social tipping point, right? So we basically said collectively, again, with the sort of social values that we're talking about, collectively, they don't represent us. We don't want that anymore. And people got behind people that reflected their values, and we kicked out a toxic government, right? So for me, gosh, I mean, the audible sigh of relief on election night, I think, you know, all of us are feeling, I guess, a sense of renewed optimism that things can change. We're not out of the woods completely. That's another story. My point is more that when we really want to make a change, when we feel fired up enough about something, that we will do it. And ultimately, this is the story of human history, Sian, right? So if you stop and you think about all the great social movements, whether it be, you know, civil rights in the US, or you think about, you know, gender equality, these are all these struggles that we've always dealt with in humanity's history. They're never a done deal. They're always going to be imperfect, and they're ongoing, right?
Well, and often it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or 2 steps forward, 2 steps back, isn't it?
Right. Okay. So it is. But is it still not a worthwhile pursuit? And I would argue that it is. And I would argue that is where we find meaning, and that is where we collectively can gather and do something that feels just better than the alternative, which is just a place of complete despair, disillusionment, and all of those things. And ultimately, yes. So my hope comes from the fact that I know that there are really good people out there, and they're all doing their best. But I also think that, you know, collectively we have so much power, and we need to harness that. And I think as Australians, many of us are feeling a lot more buoyed from that result. And for me, that was actually a part of the copy editing that was very nice to go and change and update the text, because I'd written about politics. I didn't know how it was going to end with the particular chapter I write about this sort of new form of politics and new leadership and all these sorts of things, because it's easy to point the finger, but then what are you actually doing? Like, are you stepping up to put your name down to be an MP? I mean, this, or to support someone who is, and again, that comes back down to our own capacity to contribute, and that can vary at different times in your life and all these different things. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that you can be part of the group of people that tried to change it.
There's a beautiful, it's a beautiful quote, or series of quotes in former Greens leader Bob Brown's book, Optimism, Reflections on a Life of Action. And he says, optimism, like pessimism, feeds on itself. He says, in my early years, I spent a decade or more deeply pessimistic and depressed, even though it was a reasonable reaction to the way the human world malfunctions. It wasn't an enjoyable way to live. These days, I am an optimist and I like it, because optimism is a key ingredient of any human endeavour. So sometimes it takes an act of will, doesn't it, to choose optimism over the pessimism that could feel inevitable given the scale of the problems.
Absolutely. I really love that quote. I hadn't heard it before, so thank you for sharing that one, Sian. I'll have to chase it up, but it's beautiful. And I also think that, you know, it's also important to acknowledge that those darker feelings of disillusionment and all those things will come. That is part of it as well. But ultimately, it is that choice to continue to try and just, you know, align yourself with other people who are also care deeply about these things, and do what you can from day to day. And there will be days where you want to curl up and not do anything, and that's okay as well, because, you know, it's the long haul. We have to think about this in terms of the long haul and how we're going to manage this. So
another writer who's writing about these ideas around sort of hope and optimism is Rebecca Solnit. I don't know if you've read her book called Hope in the Dark.
Yes.
Which is, here it is. I'm clutching it to my heart here. And she said, one of the things Rebecca Solnit suggests is, she said, we need litanies or recitations or monuments to the successes that we have in making the world a better, safer place, so they are landmarks in everyone's minds. So I think we need a Joëlle Gergis monument that says, look what this human being is achieving in just one lifetime. Look at what she's doing at 3 a.m. in the morning and 7 p.m. on a Friday night. But we're not so good at celebrating the successes, are we? We're kind of like, we go, phew, and then move on to the next thing.
That's right. But, you know, someone like Rebecca was a light in the dark for me. When I came across her work, I quote her quite a bit in part 3 of my book. And she actually contacted me recently to contribute to an anthology, which was a real moment. I was really honoured, actually, because she's writing her new anthology is called Not Too Late. And she wanted me to give the sort of scientific case. So, but I guess the point is that many deep thinkers are thinking about this. And so we're not alone in thinking about these complex ideas. And that's, again, where, you know, literature comes in, or all these other ways of thinking about things, because that's how we make sense of the world. And so I think it is really important to just be reminded that we're not all siloed off. We need to sort of have this sort of sense of cohesive social movement, because that it's happening everywhere around the world. It really is. It genuinely is. And I think it's pretty amazing to realize that we are living through this moment, which brings me back to what I was sort of saying right at the start of the conversation, that it is an extraordinary time to be alive. You know, we'll look back at this time. People look back and tell their kids, you know, this is, where were you when that thing happened?
Yeah.
And I think that brings meaning to the moment.
Yeah. Just a quick reminder to everyone with us tonight that now is your chance. If you have questions to ask Joëlle, then I'm going to ask one more and then hopefully open it up to everyone else. So pop your questions in the Q&A section down the bottom of your screen, and we can put them to Joëlle. So I've mentioned Bob Brown and Rebecca Solnit and Joëlle Gergis. Do you have heroes? Do you have heroines? Do you have role models? People who you look at them and you go, "Whoa, that's the kind of person I want to be." You
mean in my scientific life, or
any part of your life?
Well, to be honest, there's so many unsung heroes in science, I must say. I mean, I had the extraordinary privilege of working with Professor David Caroli at the University of Melbourne for over a decade, and he is amazing. So he's been involved in the IPCC since its very first assessment. So there's be a handful of people in the entire world who've had that type of experience. And even though he's received the death threats and all of the harassment and all that sort of stuff, the way that he mentored me through those really dark times, and just his ability to keep showing up and keep showing up and keep showing up, because you can imagine the frustration that, you know, climate scientists have been in this game longer than I have. Can you imagine how they feel about this, right? I mean, it's extremely frustrating. So for me, I would say I have a couple of personal science heroes, and David would be at the top of that list, because he is amazing. Just not only his contribution to science, but the way he mentors people and really tries to bring out the best and the unique aspects in everyone he works with. And I think that's the sign of a really fantastic human.
Yeah. Okay, so we have a question here from Janet. And that is, do you believe that climate change has been in existence for all time and that the Earth will continue to adapt regardless of what we do? But the problem this time is that not dinosaurs, but humanity will potentially be who faces extinction.
Yeah, nice question. Thank you. So I guess the premise of that is a little bit of conflation going on there. So we've always had natural climate variability. So we've seen things like ice ages and things like that. Ice sheets have waxed and waned over really long time scales, but they've happened over very, very long time scales. And then you have human beings turn up around 10,000 years ago, really, in terms of modifying the land surface, in terms of agriculture, and then the Industrial Revolution by around the 1870s. And that's where we start to see the large-scale burning of fossil fuels and the clearing of land. And so it's really what that point on, that the post-industrial period, where humans become literally a sort of like a geologic agent, if you like. So humans have become a force
/ scourge.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. So, but in the past, when we were dealing with times of dinosaurs and things like that, human beings or even early mammals were nowhere near being around at that time. So it's not exactly a like for like comparison. So it's often misunderstood, I think, out there in the community to conflate those ideas and thinking that climate variability, long-term climate variability is the same thing as climate change. A lot of people, climate scientists, we use the phrase climate change to represent those sort of human-induced changes. And a lot of that has happened, as I said, in the post-industrial period. And that's not to say that natural variability isn't occurring. They're now just sitting on top of each other and interacting in ways that keep the research community really, really busy. But that's exactly, that is the cutting edge of the science right now, is understanding how is natural variability shifting in a way that is how is it being altered by human activity. So, and the dinosaur component of that question is, well, look, basically at the higher levels of warming, it becomes pretty much impossible to adapt for human beings. So we want to avoid that. We're not there yet. As I want to be really clear that we're not there yet. That is the whole, you know, this is the title of the book is Humanity's Moment. This is our moment, guys, to step up and to avert planetary disaster, because we can do this and we should do this and we should really want to do this. But I suppose it is a complex thing. But so we don't want humans to become extinct. We don't want the biosphere to become extinct, but the rates of change, and I talk about some of the fundamentals of climate science in the early section of the book, are orders of magnitude faster. So in terms of, you know, changes coming out of ice ages and things like that, it's not a like for like comparison. So,
well, that leads us nicely onto the next question from Kester, which is, what do you see as the most serious tipping points and what can we do to avoid them?
Yeah, great question. I would say that my assessment of that is based on the literature, which is I would say the number one tipping point would be ice sheets. So we don't want to, the melting of Greenland and West Antarctica combined have 10 meters of sea level. We're already seeing really major retreats in both of those areas. That starts to really kick in. Above 2 degrees, we start to see irreversible changes in the ice sheets at that point. There are instabilities, and there's some new evidence suggesting that between 1.5 and 2, we also trigger changes. And just for context, why does this matter? You know, 250 million people currently live within 2 meters of sea level. So if you stop and you think about, these changes won't happen overnight, but these are things that will play out. And as you can see already, even here in Australia, the impacts of sea level rise. I don't know if anyone's been following some of the things going on along the New South Wales coastline, the parts of Sydney that are just completely eroding in, like Collaroy, the northern beaches. So climate change is here. Sea level rise is here, right? This is actually happening. So if you can stop and think of just compounding those impacts. So we really need to avoid destabilizing the ice sheets. And the only way we can do that is basically by reducing emissions. Now, that's the bad news. There's a little bit of bad news here, unfortunately. So the bad news is that once that process is in train, some of that warming is irreversible, right? So there's some elements of what we term committed and irreversible change. But how bad we let things get is really determined by the emissions trajectory that we take. And that's still in our hands. And it takes us back to that comment I made earlier about, you know, the next UN conference in Egypt. It'll be COP27. And that is really where the governments of the world need to come forward with stronger ambition around their emission reductions pledges. And right now, like I said, currently implemented policies have us warming between 2 and 4 degrees. That is absolutely in the catastrophic zone. That is really destroying ice sheets and plus a lot more. And so that's not good enough. And so I guess what I'm trying to say as a climate scientist, I've distilled the science. It's feasible to reduce the damage, but it's really up to people, up to us to influence our leaders in ways that are going to bring about the true political and social change we need. But until we care, so until we actually personally care about this in a way that isn't just something that feels like far away, I guess what I'm trying to say is that climate change is very much here, whether you believe it or not, whether you understand it or not, kind of like a moot point. It's happening. Yep. And I suppose this book is my account of what it's like being very aware of that and trying to help people understand to join the dots. Yep. But it's also that, we are rapidly running out of time. And so I guess that's where I sort of say, we need you.
Well, and that's another lovely segue to the next question, which is from Lou. And Lou says, I'm really interested in your discussion about the role of arts and culture in social political change. What are your thoughts about eco-activists incorporating art and performance and civil disobedience, for example, Extinction Rebellion?
Yeah, great question. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about this. So one of the things I found really inspiring about COP26, which was the Glasgow UN summit last year, is that just how many people turned up in terms of different civil society groups and people from all walks of life. But I guess for me, the role of artists is I suppose, is to provoke as well. And if you stop and you think about some of the iconic imagery that has sort of shifted public awareness, here in Australia, we have that iconic Peter Dombrowski picture of Rock Island Bend. You know, the Wilderness Society used that when they were going to dam the Franklin River. And when people saw exactly what was at stake, people say that actually influenced the outcome of the 1983 federal election. And then if you think about the Vietnam War, where there was that image of the young children running from the napalm bombings and seeing the human impact of war, and that really started the no war kind of movement and all that sort of stuff. So in terms of just sheer raw human emotion, I don't think we've got anything that comes as close. That's what art is, right? That is what art is. And I think it's such a powerful medium because we kind of bypass some of the logic and reason, because logic and reason will only get you so far. And that's what I'm trying to say as a scientist. And that's the whole purpose of me writing this book, right? Is that we don't have all the answers, not by a long shot, but there are people, creative people, sensitive people that will find ways that will help shift the emotional world of people in ways that might make a difference. And I guess that's my call out. So personally, on the civil disobedience side, everybody has different ways of doing things. So I'm not going to pass judgment on that. So, you can contribute in a way that feels authentic for you. I get it. I do get it. And there's even scientists who are starting to do that as well.
Yes, locking themselves onto the doors of fossil fuel companies and climate scientists. Amazing.
Yeah. And I can completely sympathize with that position. But I guess for someone like me, that could shut a few doors for me, right? So I guess for me at the moment, I'm someone that likes to try and walk the middle line. I want to bring as many people on board as possible. So I guess that comes back down to the sort of the spectrum of the shade of activist you are. And that's okay. And it is all welcome at this point. Actually, at this point, anything would do. I guess what I'm trying to say is that we need it all. But I actually really, the chapter I probably loved writing the most, aside from the epilogue, was chapter 11, which was all about this, the role of culture and art, because I really feel until we start to care about this in a really different way, because I can give you facts and figures, that's what I do as a scientist, but until it's either going to be a play or a poem or a song or something that shifts your emotional, because it only needs to be enough to just get behind the person who's, just vote for the person who's going to do something. Okay, just vote for the person. We saw it happen in the federal election.
Yes.
So I don't see this as fluffy. I see this is actually the missing link. I couldn't believe it. And in the book, it's like an epiphany when I went through a really serious period of depression while I was writing this book. And part of the way out for me was this realization that actually art, not only did it comfort me in terms of its beauty, that's why I'm saying inherently art is just so important, because it's just a lifeline out to remember that we can do beautiful things, but also it can be really political and it can be so influential. And so I could talk about this for a full hour, actually, because I'm really passionate about this at the moment. Because I
have to do it again sometime.
I know, but I really feel I actually did a really fantastic event with Climb Art, which is the first. It's a gallery in Melbourne, in Richmond. It's run by Deborah Hart, and it's the first climate emergency gallery, dedicated gallery in the world. And they do extraordinary things. And so I'm feeling pretty amped up after a really beautiful evening with them. But I also feel like, and maybe you would agree with this, Shana, or I'm interested in your thoughts actually, but this becomes a much more inclusive conversation, doesn't it? When we're not talking just about renewable energy policy and electric vehicles and all these really technical things that are hard for people to understand. I think if you can make it more inclusive, where people can feel like they can contribute something, then all of a sudden you've got a whole other section of the population that were not engaged previously.
Yep. I couldn't agree more, Joëlle. And I'm very, very sad that it's 8:30 and we're going to have to.
Oh, yes.
We're going to have to wonder. I just want to quickly read you beautiful comment from Lucinda, who says, I've been reading your book and have filled it with post-it notes to refer back to. I'm the mother of 3 young daughters, and this is such important work. I want to say thank you for translating the research and statistics for the broader community. It really is life-changing to read your work. And I completely agree with Lucinda. And I just want to say thank you so much, Joëlle, not just for being with us here tonight, but for your whole lifetime of incredible commitment to this, the biggest issue of forever, the biggest issue of forever. So thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who joined us tonight for this, this difficult but important conversation. Humanities Moment is published by Black Books Inc. and is available to borrow from Geelong Regional Libraries, as is, of course, Joelle's earlier book, Sunburnt Country, which we didn't have a chance to talk about tonight, but that's out there. You can also, of course, buy copies of either of Joelle's books from your local bookstores. Thank you to Geelong Regional Libraries for organising and hosting this event. And let's all get out there and do whatever we can in this moment that you have shown us tonight. Thank you so much, Joëlle.
It's been such a treat. Thanks, Sian.
See you, everybody. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.